Welcome everyone to the second panel at Somnambulations. My name is Josh, and I'm the moderator of this panel, and very happy to welcome Cedric Kayser and Sandra Huber for a discussion along the lines of sleep's creative thresholds. So Cedric and Sandra, the bios are, Alana posted the bios in the chat to save us a bit of time. And is Cedric going first or is Sandra going first? Cedric will go first. Perfect. So Cedric's paper is titled Bodily Atmospheres, the Impact of Ambient Music on the First Stage of Sleep, on N1 Sleep. Thank you, Cedric.
Thanks Joshua and the Sociability of Sleep team for inviting me to this event and the opportunity to present my ongoing research. I think it's a promising series that will hopefully foster critical investigations into the expansive field of sleep-related epistemologies in the future, as insomnia remains a major public health problem in Western countries today. As time is of essence, I'll try to keep my presentation as focused as possible, but there will be time at the end for questions. In my academic practice, I'm exploring different representations of the lived body from the 20th century to the contemporary period. In particular, I focus on different modes of a bodily experience: spatial vertigo, illness, altered states, erotic transfer. For instance, in my doctoral dissertation, I made the case that French writer Marcel Proust, as a witness of his time, was describing how technical devices affect the subject's seeing in a period of overwhelming urbanization. I'd like to extend this line of questioning to sleep phenomena, and in particular to the threshold between consciousness and light sleep. In order to illustrate this transitional state, I'd like to start with an example drawn from my personal experience, which occurred after a work meeting last December in Montreal. As I was driving up the A15 on Décarie, I realized that the highway had disappeared on the blankets of snow, forcing me to slow down while adjusting to the rhythm of the other drivers. Upon starting my engine, I had put on a recording of Structures from Silence by Steve Roach that was playing at low volume on my car stereo. In slow focus, relaxed, I noticed how my body attuned to the pulse of the music, taking in the surreal scene that unfolded to my windshield. While the worries of the day receded from my immediate awareness, work-related deadlines, papers to grade, conferences to prepare, I entered a transitional state between motoric response and lucid thought. As this mild case of highway hypnosis suggests, bodily atmospheres provide affordances, spaces to dwell at a time where public places mainly invite transit. In the following, my aim is to offer a phenomenological account of sleep. I will advance the notion that falling asleep should lead us to a renewed understanding of bodily atmospheres and the attunement to physical surroundings, and in the last section I will briefly outline possible modes of applications for these findings. Over the last years, I have drawn from a dominant philosophical tradition from the early 20th century that is commonly known as Phenomenology. Developed in the works of philosophers like Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, or Sartre, Phenomenology offers a first-person account of lived experience, and thus cannot be reduced to the gathering of the world in a unity of consciousness, which is the case of idealism, or the neutral gaze of science, a thinking which looks on from above, in the words of Merleau-Ponty. On the strength of this return to the things themselves, the way they imprint themselves on us, Phenomenology provides a detailed account of lived experience and tackles important issues such as embodiment, desire, the production of space, and active perception. At once perceiving subject and a visible object that can be seen, the lived body appears as the vantage point from whence the world is always already there. I'd like to quote a brief passage from The Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela. Our circumstances and moods may change, but the body appears stable. The body is the location point of the senses. We look at the world from the vantage point of the body, and we perceive the objects of our senses to be related spatially to our body. Though the mind may wander, sleeping or daydreaming, we count on returning to the same body. End of quote. Further, the body described by Merleau-Ponty in The Visible and the Invisible is part of the flesh of the world, chair du monde in French. According to the philosopher, the world is made of the same stuff as the body, and to illustrate this point, I'd like to bring up the following image. On the one hand, we have the Impressionist painters who set up their easel in the middle of the scenes they tried to capture, who were painting on the ground, or peinture sur le motif, as we say in French, and which corresponds roughly to the traditional vision of the body as an object for observation. On the other hand, the inactive approach fostered by researchers like Francisco Varela is closer to the skein of wool, this assembly of threads which underlines the bursting forth from a constellation of elements, and which we find in the notion of flesh of the world, in Merleau-Ponty's later writings, a kind of Mobius strip translating the folding back of the visible on the seeing body. Thus, the body is not in front of the world as the painter in front of the easel, but the body is always immersed in an environment to which it reacts. Our gaze envelopes the things and drapes them with its own flesh. And yet, tackling sleep from a phenomenological perspective remains a paradox. As the writer Drew Leader points out in The Absent Body, my own body disappears when I am asleep in a way more thorough than any yet encountered, since sleep is precisely a form of withdrawal from experience. End of quote. So let's take it from there. The boom of ambient from Brian Eno to William Bazinski. So how does sound affect us? And what affordances do atmospheres provide us today? So as Catherine Hales points out, whereas sight is always sharp and delineated, sound envelopes the body as if it were an atmosphere to be experienced rather than an object to be dissected. Perhaps that is why researchers in virtual reality have found that sound is much more effective than sight in imparting emotional tonalities to their simulated worlds. So if our experience is more fragmented today, it largely corresponds to a wood distribution of perceptual content. In an interview with the New Statesman electronic composer Daniel Lopatin, also known as One of Trick's Point Never, talks about the phenomenology of listening that we experience when we direct our attention to a piece of music. The thickness of the moment is modulated by clicks of our computer keyboards, the diffuse noises that reach us from the outside, and the images that we just browsed online. So in other words, listening addresses the entire body and is all the more important for the different senses. This phenomenology of active listening provides a gateway to a questioning of bodily atmospheres and mood regulation by way of ambient media. In a recent essay, Paul Rockett, a postdoctoral fellow in global media and film studies at Brown University, traces back the history of ambient and its boom in the late 1970s to Isaac Newton's reading of ambient medium as a substance surrounding the human body, thus referring to air, that which makes up the atmosphere. The term atmosphere itself expanded over the next centuries to gradually refer to the subjectively felt feeling and tone of a place. As Roquette points out, unlike the more objective term atmosphere, ambient always implies the more subjective element of mediation at work, some kind of agency behind the production of mood, and the focus on the human body attuning to it. Historically, this approach to ambient media as a practice of self-care emerged as a reaction to earlier modes of atmospheric media that essentially focused on stimulus progression. For example, the functional music launched by American corporation Muzak was designed to orient consumer behavior and spur working productivity. Developed by psychologists, this elevator music expanded on the scientific management principles that characterized Taylorism in the late 19th century. So this ideal of a music you're hearing without actively listening to it, to humanize between hyphens working conditions, belies an explicit focus on collective mood manipulation. So the idea of ambient media as a tool for atmospheric regulation can be traced back to Brian Eno and his musical output in the late 70s. In the liner notes to his landmark album in ambient and electronic music, Brian Eno hints at the immersive quality of his recent experiments. According to him, ambient music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. End of quote. Eno started experimenting with this idea on 1975's discrete music upon discovering a new way of listening to music, where the sound merges with the background noises of the environment at low volumes when it is on the verge of vanishing. Upon discovering the ambient work of Brian Eno and contemporaries like Harold Budd and even David Bowie, my perception of music started to shift as I came to interpret very different sound materials with this ambient qualification, such as field recordings, musique concrète, clusters of violin arrangements. Approaching the concept of atmospheres from an inactive perspective, so perceiving identity at the intersection of mind, body, and environment, I thus developed an interest in the impact ambient sounds can have on the first phase of non-REM sleep, which I'll get back to in a minute. So what distinguishes the work of ambient artists in the late 70s throughout the 80s is the inclusion of uncertainty into an otherwise relaxing mix, thus maintaining a certain ambivalence at its core. As Paul Roquette notes, unlike more purely utilitarian forms of healing media, ambient works open up spaces within the overall calm to register a wider range of emotional uncertainty, even anxiety. And it's a point that Brian Eno underlines in the same liner note that I mentioned earlier. So according to Eno, whereas conventional background music is produced by stripping away all sense of doubt and uncertainty, thus all genuine interest from the music, ambient music retains these qualities. And whereas their intention is to brighten the environment by adding stimulus to it, ambient music is intended to induce calm and a space to think. So I think that this element can be illustrated by another sonic example, namely William Bazinski's disintegration tapes, inspired by minimalist composers such as Steve Reich and Terry Riley. Using tape loops and wheel-to-wheel transfer platforms, Bazinski developed a meditative style by experimenting with short melodic loops played over themselves to produce feedback, often consisting of snippets of processed music captured from an easy listening station. While transferring his old recordings to digital, Bazinski followed a simple process. The composer starts a loop on his digital recorder and leaves it running. Returning to his material later, he finds that the tape is gradually eroding as it plays. As he came to realize during this process, the iron oxide particles on the tape slowly turned to dust and settled inside the recorder, leaving only the plastic tape behind. Bazinski repeated the process with other loops and obtained similar results. Shortly after the September 11 attacks, from the roof of his Brooklyn apartment, Bazinski set up a video camera on a tripod and captured the twilight of that day, pointing the camera at Lower Manhattan. Just like the hypnotic quality of his ambient tape music, the gradual erasure and the images of the ruin of that tragic day form the material trace of a disappearance. So as the title of my presentation suggests, I'm interested in the specific moment between consciousness and transitioning into sleep when the lines begin to blur. It's a sequence that we repeat at the close of every day. We lie down, relax our eyes and focus on our breathing. Losing our grasp on the business of daily matters, there's this rare moment where we realize that our semi-conscious mind doesn't respond to a clear logic anymore. The absurdness of our thoughts reassuring us that we're drifting off into sleep. At this stage, we may experience sudden pangs of consciousness, muscle contraction that happens when we are in a non-REM, non-rapid eye movement sleep, or we may even experience hypnagogic hallucination. I think you touched on that subject before. So false sensory experience that can be interpreted as echoes from past sensations. This liminal state where conscious thoughts emerge and disappear, while it may only last a few seconds, marks our attunement to bodily atmospheres, not unlike the dream logic underpinning the silencio scene in David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. While we dissociate from our conscious selves, distant figures drift into view. And in the terms of Husserl's Phenomenology, we become witness to a process of Hineinströmen, of a streaming in of information. So here I'm referring to the first stage of sleep, commonly referred to as N1, short for non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM1, and which can be characterized by light sleep, high frequency, low amplitude, the heart rate starting to decrease steadily, while the body temperature also starting to drop, and electrical brain activity slowing down, while we remain sensitive to outer stimuli. In particular, the impact of ambient music on this stage of sleep, while largely ignored by the scientific community, should foster new modes of shaping the conversation around sleep and the affordances provided by our surroundings. For instance, at 60 BPM, the heart slows and sinks to brain activity, which is characteristic of ambient music and the way it unfolds over a stereo field, enhancing our inner sense of calm and concentration, while serotonin and dopamine levels decrease. So at this stage, the body produces theta waves, and there is an indistinction between sleeping and wakefulness. I'd like to think of it as walking into a different room of an unknown apartment and hesitating at the door threshold. When information on the phenomenology of falling asleep remains scarce, French writer Marcel Proust provides a detailed account of this experience in the opening sections of Time Regained. In the context of my doctoral research, I've been able to familiarize myself with this text, which systematically traces the different stages of sleep experience, from the phenomenology of the half-awake body, longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure, to the close-up of Albertine asleep. The insomniac narrator in Proust's novel is center stage, as we will live his complex relationship with sleep over the 7 volumes of this novel. So here's a sample that I found quite interesting. I would fall asleep, and often I would be awake again for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes to settle the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savor, in an instantaneous flash of perception, the sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room, the whole surroundings of which I formed but an insignificant part, and whose unconsciousness I should very soon return to share. So it is this Proustian moment, a boundary made according to Gilles Deleuze, of non-language visions and auditions, but which only language makes possible, that I would like to explore through the implementation of certain protocols, questioning the link to others that underlie our experience of the lived body. So, to explore the threshold of sleep, I'd like to set up a study in collaboration with a sound designer, an architect, and a researcher in the cognitive sciences. And in particular, I'd like to apply sleep protocols corresponding to the 3 levels of embodiment described by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. First, the neural networks concerning the structures that characterize thoughts and concepts at the neural level. Secondly, a phenomenology of sleep, such as described in some of Merleau-Ponty's writings. So the sensations accessible to consciousness and the feel of experience, the way things appear to us while we drift into sleep. And thirdly, the cognitive unconscious, so the creative part of the body regulating and attuning to certain atmospheres, and which refers to the vast part of ourselves under the visible tip of consciousness, the mental operations that guide the perceptual and sensory motor aspects of our bodies to make possible conscious experience. So while Proust has provided an in-depth illustration of non-REM sleep 1 at the beginning of Swann's Way, and highly detailed observations of hypnagogic sleep, how could we possibly document this transitional state? So in setting up protocols, I was thinking of creating in the first step a safe and calm environment equipped with a sleeping station or capsule, with a selection of ambient themes that could be selected via a MIDI controller, a microphone being set up or a dictaphone to record the user's impressions while easing off into sleep, or the possibility to note it down with a pad. And these transcripts would then serve as a basis for a data bank and the production of mood boards, while blood pressure and electrical brain activity could be measured with matching equipment. So yeah, that's like a first outline, quite experimental, of sleep protocols that I would like to set up to explore this liminal state that I presented in this intervention. So thanks so much for your attention, and yeah, looking forward to fielding your questions.
All right, thank you, Cedric. And the questions will come after the next paper, but that was both a really kind of elegant sort of history of ambient music and its relation to phenomenology, and a really kind of provocative sort of laboratory scenario that you envision there. So it's really interesting. Thank you for that. And we're going to shift now to Sandra Huber, who will be presenting a paper called SleepWriter, composing the oh my goodness, the electricity of sleep. I couldn't read my own handwriting. Thank you very much, Sandra. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Cedric. That was super fascinating. And I think has a lot of overlaps with what I'm going to be talking about. Let me just see if I can share this keynote presentation. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. I'm Sandra, and I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia, where I look at actually witchcraft and the relationship of witches to the dead and how they communicate with the dead. However, today I'm going to be talking about something totally different, but something that also relates to death, or is often compared to death, which is sleep. And so I did this project a little while ago, so I'm really happy to be able to be here today and share it with you all, and also see what you're working on. So in 2010, I received a residency via a foundation called Artists in Lab Switzerland to work as a kind of writer in residence at the sleep laboratories of Mehdi Tafti and Paul Franken in Lausanne at the Center for Integrative Genomics. So it resulted in a book, Assembling the Morrow, A Poetics of Sleep, which came out with Talon Books in 2014, where I attempted to interface the electricity of the brain in sleep with words, or with a very long poem that is largely asemic, as you can see here. So in short, to combine two very different sets of transcription, sleep data and waking data. Of course, all data is very much awake, which was sort of half of the play that I was interested in. So in this case, I created a very long poem that I managed to write, or was able to write, onto the neural oscillations of my own sleeping brain, using a text editor app that I co-designed with a programmer named Manolis Polka. So a little background on what I was doing. Here's my very awful slide of the Swiss Artists and Labs logo, and a photograph that I took of the Center for Integrative Genomics on the walk that I would take every morning from my apartment in Lausanne to the center, where I would essentially work. So Swiss Artists and Labs is obviously a Swiss foundation, and every year they pick 4 different artists to go into 4 different scientific laboratories in Switzerland. So I've always been fascinated by sleep, and by dreams in particular before I went to the lab. And so I applied, and interestingly, the scientists were the ones who interviewed the potential artists to come in, and I managed to convince them to take me. And so I went to work. I went to work in a laboratory, and here I was every day working for 9 months, not an insignificant amount of time, at this laboratory with biologists and neuroscientists and sleep technicians who were working on various problems within the science of sleep. So I really immersed myself in the laboratory. I attended all their meetings. I read what they were reading. I tried to attend classes learning about neuroscience and biology. I have a background in literature and creative writing, so this was quite a stretch for me. And then I also really started to work with the sleep technicians to learn how to score sleep first in the brains of mice, and then how to score sleep in the brains of humans. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means, in case that sounds totally like alien language. Scoring sleep is basically how to read brain waves and how to annotate them so that you understand what stages of sleep the animal is in. So also when I was at this lab, I remember the first project that I wanted to do before I even became enamored with the electricity of the brain in sleep was I was fascinated by the mice. I don't know if you guys have ever visited a sleep lab of any significant size. I don't know about the ones in Montreal, but the sleep lab at the CIG, in the basement is all the animal subjects that are used, in order so that we can learn how our foundational behavior plays out. And I was so fascinated by these mice that at first I wanted to write a children's book about, I'm going to use my residency to write a children's book about the mice in this lab because it was so omnipresent and actually part of my job, or not part of my job, but I signed up to do it. I put my name on the roster, which is what everybody was doing in the lab, is that you take a turn at going down into the basement and actually keeping the mice awake. So I would have to go down there and for a half an hour keep these poor mice awake while experiments were being conducted. So this is really I always speak about interfacing with the scientists and the technicians, but I was also really interfacing with the animals as well at the lab, which was another fascinating part of it. And I definitely have some serious bad karma in terms of mice to work out, in terms of keeping them awake during experiments. However, when I got over the mice, which I've never really gotten over clearly, I was fascinated by, on screens all around me was this polysomnography data. Everybody has seen this. This is called polysomnography. This is a montage. You can make your montage into anything you want, into any parts of the body that you want to be recording. But when I saw these recordings for the first time, and this is also a lot about what Cedric was talking about as well, it really struck me that sleep is about rhythm. So this is something I've always known about language, working in writing and reading. Of course, language is about rhythm, but I realized really for the first time how much sleep is composed of rhythms. And you can think of just like the small rhythms that are playing out around you right now, like the rhythms of your breath, the rhythms of your pen across the paper, the rhythms of maybe your washing machine in the other room. We're surrounded by these rhythms, and sleep is no different. So I really got interested in these very visible electrical rhythms of the brain and the body. So to be clear, as we all know, sleep is a behavior, but the devices that collect sleep and make it visible, have to make it into an object. Science makes everything into an object, of course, that it can observe and that it can hold. So this is how sleep is largely made into an object, even though sleep is not a thing, it's a process. So I became fascinated by this visual that I was seeing all around me. It really reminded me of sort of asemic writing. So here's a picture of the Electro Encephalogram, some sketches by Hans Berger, who discovered it and started using it in the late 20s, early 30s. And here you can see a poem or a piece of art, however you look at it, by the artist Myrthe de Message. So I really was interested in how I could sort of make a language that interacted meaningfully with what Hans Berger was doing with his experiment of turning the brain, the electricity of the brain, into this visual rhythm. So I immediately set about trying to learn this whole other secret language. I've always been interested in secret languages. And here's this whole other secret language I could learn, composed of gamma, delta, sigma, theta, alpha, beta, that makes up the particular electroencephalography or EEG patterns of the different stages of sleep. So I needed to know what they stood for in the symbolic order of the science of sleep. And to be clear, I didn't have to. My only job at the lab, like I could have written some lyric poems, which would have made my life so much easier. Like nobody was making me do this. But I'm just the kind of obsessive person who I really just wanted to throw myself into this. And interestingly, as a result from focusing so much on sleep, I actually developed really bad insomnia while I was staying at the lab. So it was almost like I was trying to get too close to sleep, and sleep was sort of trying to, put up a stop sign. At the same time at the lab, so I was not only learning from the sleep technicians how to score sleep, I was, of course, attending talks and learning about what the scientists were up to in the lab. And I can talk more about that in the question period, what the particular scientists were doing that I was working with. But I was on the whole surprised by how mysterious sleep was, not just to us who are non-scientists, but to the scientists themselves, to the neuroscientists and biologists. We spend, roughly a third of our lives sleeping. We don't really know why. There are lots of theories about why, but the basic foundational question of why we have to sleep remains largely speculative. So I was fascinated by the mystery of this. At the same time, I was also confronted with myself as an outsider in the lab. So the scientists who I worked beside every day knew that I was this kind of different person. I was this artist put into a lab by a foundation. And they were like, all right, they had, I would get asked if I was a journalist or an anthropologist. And sometimes people were suspicious about what I was doing, or I was very much an outsider. I'd be at meetings and I would get singled out in really funny ways. And etc. Over time, of course, because it was so long, I developed more of like a chummy relationship with the scientists that I worked directly with, but still I was kind of this outsider unit in the lab. And this constant sense of outsidedness actually made me feel closer to the object I was studying, which was sleep, which is a state that is outside, which is an outsider state to wakingness. So it made me think perhaps that the reason why we don't really understand sleep is because we're approaching it as wakers. We approach sleep from the waking world, and we can't really get close to it or unravel its mysteries as such. So I wanted to get inside of sleep, and the first step to doing this was really just going to the hospital lab. So the lab that I worked at was at the Center for Integrative Genomics, and then they also had a sister lab that was at the University Hospital, which would, was also function as a sleep clinic. So they would have patients there as well. So I went and I worked a lot with the nurses at the University Hospital. After learning how to score sleep on mice, I would go there and actually sit with them overnight and learn how to monitor the human behavior of sleep as well. So by the time I went there to get my data, they already knew me and knew what I was doing, and I could already sort of score my own sleep at that point. So I decided to use myself as a subject. I still didn't really know what I was going to do. And the scientists were sort of scandalized by this because it's not, unique in art or even in anthropology to use the self as a subject, but in biology, it's completely taboo. You do not do this. So it felt odd to sort of be doing this, but it also felt odd to use a data set from a person who wasn't my own. But in doing this, I also created this further outside. I created this whole ream of sleep data that was also like, if you've ever looked at your own data of your brain or your body, it's a very kind of uncanny sensation of seeing yourself from like an outsidedness. It's a mirror, but at once it's a mirror that doesn't really reflect in the way that you're used to that. So I stayed overnight to get the signals of my sleep, and this is what a night nurse would see. So the night nurse had about 5 screens around her, just like this, where she could see a little video. It's very panopticon-like what she sees. At this particular clinic, there were 5 sleep rooms. So she can see me as a sleeper. Here I'm just writing, and here's the waking data. This is the particular montage that I used, which is just the EOG, which is my eye movements, and the EEG, which is my brain. Of course, I was set up with all sorts of other recording data, but this is the screen that I ended up focusing on as the montage that I wanted to use for my project. But the sleep clinic, it's sort of here that you realize how kind of surveilled sleep is. And it's, the pathologies of sleep are highly surveilled, and of course, meaningfully so, because people want to get to the bottom of what is wrong with their sleep, whether it be apnea or some sort of parasomnia. And so here I went in to get the data of my own sleep. And what I ended up doing is I just wanted to basically turn my neural oscillations into words, into a long poem. And I composed this poem differently for every stage of sleep, which is too lengthy to get into now, and nerdy. But yeah, so I worked with this programmer, and we mainly made a sleep editing or a text editing app where we vectorized my brainwaves, and I could turn them into poetry. As you can see here, I wasn't really interested in writing poetry that was even necessarily legible, because I was enchanted by the illegibility of sleep. And my meaning, I didn't want to clarify sleep. I didn't want to put it into a lyric poem. I wanted to sort of interact with the illegibility itself. And this felt like the most interesting thing to do. On the other side of that, it took hours and hours and hours. Like you can see how much writing is here in the window. You can see my writing. This was not copy pasting. This was me writing the waves. So it was almost this trance-like state that I entered as well during the writing process. So I was interested, first of all, by the fact that sleep remains mysterious. And, often science will try to elucidate the mysteries, right? That's what they're there for. And we like them for that on the most part. But I knew I wasn't there for that. My job is not to be a scientist. And I really wanted to live in the mysteries. And then I was also interested in the fact that words are always awake, and that data is awake, and that sleep is something completely different. So I wanted to create this kind of hybrid monster that in effect allowed me as a writer to enter into a kind of different state that was maybe, as Cedric was saying, this kind of threshold or doorway between sleeping and waking. So I'll just show you a few of the examples of the poems that I wrote. There's also like this moves. I was looking for my video because I made it into a video, and then there was a sound artist named Karl-Heinz Jaron who actually did a sound piece to it using pink noise, I think mostly, and some other things. But I couldn't find my video before the presentation, but I can try to weed that out if anyone's interested in. So this actually is just meant to move like across the screen, like you'd see brainwaves move. This is End When Sleep that Cedric was telling us about. And, you know, hypnagogia, the falling, you're falling asleep. Alpha waves here of relaxed waking are weeding out and giving way to predominantly theta waves. And you can see here there's an artifact, which just means that maybe I moved the electrode, or that, you know, something happened. And when I saw an artifact, I would just use like a diacritic or a piece of punctuation to fill in that space. So here you have N2 sleep. You can already see how it looks a little bit different. Here you're really falling asleep. You're not dreaming as much. This is characterized by what is called K complexes and sleep spindles, these little tightly woven waves. And so a little bit of a note on sleep stages. So in 1953, Eugene Azarinsky, who was a grad student working in the lab of Nathaniel Kleitman, I believe, discovered REM sleep. And as soon as he discovered REM sleep, it became clear that sleep is not a unitary phenomenon, that it's actually composed of, I think it's 4 or 5 discrete stages of sleep. So 3 or 4 of non-REM, and then 1 stage of REM or dreaming sleep. That's not to say that we don't dream during non-REM, but it's a different kind of dreaming. And I can also talk about that more later if you're interested in. But when I first came to the lab, I was fascinated by dreams. And when I was at the lab, I became fascinated even more by all this time we spend in non-dreaming, which is significantly different than, you know, dreaming is a little bit like waking. But then there's this huge scape of time we spend where our brain is just doing quote unquote nothing, but is extremely active. You can see how active this is here. And this is like a problem that goes back very far in philosophy. Also, Descartes really wrestled with the problem that he suspected there was, you know, a point in sleep where we're not doing anything, therefore are we being? So I was really fascinated by these sort of landscapes where it's extremely active. Sleep is not a passive state, as we all know. Sleep is an extremely active state, but it's active in a way that really challenges our notions of what that means. And so here's S3 sleep. This is slow wave oscillations. You can see how different this is from waking. Here we're in a completely different state of being as organisms. And this really, like, writing this also really called into play like differences between creativity and automaticity, and the body and the machine, and sleep as well, just by being such an active state that is totally different from what we're doing now, right? Which is listening or speaking. Really calls into question these perimeters between states. And this is REM sleep, which is also, REM sleep is also called paradoxical sleep sometimes because it resembles waking so much. So here, the dreaming, this is the dreaming mind, which the waves look quite a bit similar to relaxed waking, or even active waking, actually. So in the book that I put out with Talon Books, they did want me to transcribe all of this, but you can see the transcriptions. It's not really like, even in the transcriptions, it's like, yes, it's poems maybe, but I wanted, and at all levels of this, I really wanted to keep the illegibility and the mystery intact. I didn't want to write something in which I was trying to address sleep from an outsider, but in which I was trying to enter with words into this sort of hybrid state, I suppose. Yeah. I love the state of illegibility, I think, because Cedric was saying, and I wrote it down, when we're going to sleep, we're giving up our natural resistance. I thought this was so beautiful. We're letting go. In order to sleep, you have to let go. And in order to enter into a kind of state of illegibility or mystery, you also have to let go. And this enters us into a different way of interacting with what knowledge is in the first place. So I really love this idea of letting go, both when we're doing our own artistic projects and also when we're falling asleep. We have to let go of the day and enter something completely different in order for our organisms to even survive. So that teaches us something about knowledge and about how we, how we interact with different forms of knowing in our bodies and our minds. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Josh, you are on mute.
Wow, imagine that. I was on mute. Oh my goodness. Okay. You think I would know, like you think you just know by this point. I apologize. Thank you, Sandra. That was a fantastic talk. And we have time for questions and answers. But maybe the question on everyone's mind, or at least certainly mine, Sandra, is the book still available? Still in print?
Yeah, the book is still in print. It's called Assembling the Morrow. I can put it in the chat.
Thank you. I will bracket my questions because I think Erin has a question. Please, Erin, go ahead.
Yes. Hi. There we go. That was such an exciting talk. Thank you. I really appreciate your take on data and unconsciousness. My question for you is that you said that words and data are always awake. Can you expand upon that a little bit more? I just I wouldn't have intuitively thought so, but I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I'm sort of using poetic license when I say that. I think that, you know, when we're using words, we're using words in a way that is meeting words in this kind of space of knowledge. And maybe knowledge is always awake. And there's a different form of, there's one form of like, you know, science, for example, creating data sets, creating like this behavior like sleep, this very ephemeral behavior, and this very different behavior to what we do when we're waking. And science is, or biology and neuroscience of sleep is really trying to examine it and to put it into the world of waking, because we can't examine something if we're not in the world of waking. And I guess also when we are all writing, I know we go into kind of like a different, you know, form of consciousness is very focused, probably lots of alpha waves, probably, you know, different from say, when we're conversing at a party, but it's still waking, right? So when we're sleeping, you know, it would be hard to get somebody to write a composition when they're in non-REM sleep. Like they wouldn't be able to interact with words in the same way. And same with data. Data is a product of the waking world. It's something that we as wakers produce and not something that we as sleepers produce. We as sleepers produce maybe more ephemeral things like breath or sweat or dreams, but we don't really produce data. I hope that answers your question.
I have another precision to make. I'm just writing this down. It's so fascinating. Performance. Okay, and like I guess that the precision, because I thought it was interesting because like the phrase words and data are always awake. It kind of, it's very non-anthropocentric in a way, because I kind of ask myself like, well, like for example, the words are awake now because I'm looking at them, but if I close them, are they asleep or are they always awake? The words is like, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
like, I don't think there's a wrong answer. I just want to know your perspective.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's beautiful. That makes me think that like all the words, like I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, and all the words and all the books are not at the moment being activated, right?
Okay.
So, but if I took one of those books off the shelf, then perhaps I'm waking it up in a certain way.
Okay, so it is in interacting with the words that they become awake. So maybe words and data are not always awake? Like, I'm really not trying to call you on this. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so it's in interacting with so it's not that they're always awake, but that by interacting with them they wake up, or that by producing
Yeah,
them
I'm
they
not
wake up.
sure. I love where you're going, and it's so
Because
poetic.
it would
Like
be so
thinking,
truly exciting to me if I could believe that the words and the data were always awake. I just don't I don't intuitively believe that.
yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could see it both ways. I think maybe perhaps the creation of the data and the creation of the words is a waking experience. But perhaps in doing that, we leave the words and the data to enter into their own forms of consciousness.
Ooh, okay. Thank you. That's enough for me.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. I think Cedric, I saw a hand up. Did you have a question, Cedric? Please
Yeah,
go ahead.
sure.
And
So,
I have a question for you too, but you go first.
thanks so much, Sandra, for this fascinating talk. I loved how you touched upon the paradox of perceiving your lived body from the outside, interpreting it in terms of vibrations, graphs, and I think it really talks to the way since the end of 19th century we are witnessing a shift or a series of shifts in our relation to the body. So I'm thinking, of course, of X-rays and the chronophotographs of Etienne Jules Marais that allow us to explore the hidden aspects of our body. So we see our hearts beating on the screen, we hear our recorded voices from the outside, and I'm really interested in the way that this this new perception of the body, this infra perception in a way, kind of like affects our bodily atmospheres, the spatiality of our bodies, and how this data can be used to shape our personal narratives. So thanks so much for this presentation.
Totally, I love that, and I also saw that a lot in your presentation. Just the way that we can create different forms of data or different forms of, interacting with that objectified image. That it doesn't always have to be the standard that is shown to us, and that we've learned, like as you said, to mirror ourselves back to.
If I think we have time, we can go to Alana just mentioned, so we can go to about right up to 11:30, just so we can stay with this discussion a little bit longer, and then we'll take a maybe 5-minute break and launch the next panel right then. But I had a question for Cedric. So Cedric, I guess one question I liked how you defined ambient music kind of in two ways. Like on the one hand, you defined it as creating space, right? Like sort of sounds that kind of give a feeling of spaciousness to the listener and kind of room to think. But then you also kind of defined ambient music in terms of affect, like it's associated with calm, with a kind of removing doubts or anxieties and fears. And I just wonder, like, how do you like how do you think about uh, how do you think about this kind of affective versus this kind of maybe very technical ways of creating or defining ambient music? Like how do you reconcile them, if at all? Just any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we have to provide a bit of context. So the first ambient recordings, be it like Brian Eno or his contemporaries in Japan around the same time, were very concerned about the way sound could be used as a forced top-down way of manipulating moods, manipulating affects in order to enhance productivity. And so I'm really interested in the way that this music that is that is pretty calm and almost like hypnotic, and affords spaces to dwell in. How it's actually how it emerged as a visceral reaction to this coerced form of mood regulation, and so it's a bit like punk rock in the 70s reacted to a lot of issues in society, to the technicizing of musical arrangements at the time. So I see ambient music as also this iconoclastic force in that context. So I hope I'm not like shocking you with with my statements, but it's just the way that I perceive it. So for me, ambient music is something that really touches us at the core, and which actually brings forth a visceral reaction, something that is really like playing out in a most like in a deepest bodily feel, if I may say so. So thanks so much for your question.
Thank you. When I was organizing this panel, I thought, oh, we'll have just a couple of two-person panels. We'll have tons of room for discussion. It's crazy how quickly that flies by. I think what we have to do now is, since another panel is due to start basically now, let's take 5 minutes, okay, and for a break, and then at 11:35. Apple computer time, we'll start the third panel of the morning. So thank you to Cedric and to Sandra.